The most overrated Scholomance Academy cards. These actually aren't them. These are 3 legendaries that are pretty overrated that didn't make the list. We have some cards in this video that were even more celebrated, expected to be amazing by players before the expansion, but in reality, so far, haven't seen much play. If you're looking for the methodology for determining this list, that's down in the description below. Before we get started, I want to issue one big warning. I'm not saying these cards are terrible forever. In fact, I think a few of them will still be pretty good at some stage. Just right now, they haven't lived up to expectations yet. It's not a condemning of their quality, just a reporting of reality at the moment. That said, let's move into our number 5 card first here. The 5th most overrated card from Scholomance Academy. It's Crawlisk Bark Stripper for Hunter. This one has fallen 75 spots from its pre-expansion ranking by players and really isn't seeing much play at all. I've seen this pop into a couple Highlander Hunter lists, but they seem to be the worst versions of Highlander Hunter at the moment. So even in a deck that's only running one of each card and is kind of scraping together those bottom 5 cards usually, Crawlisk Bark Stripper still doesn't seem like the best option. And for me, that's not a huge surprise. I gave this card 2 stars. I thought it was going to be slow and awkward to use for Hunter. They tend to like more pressure than reactivity, and the stat line on this one doesn't create a ton of pressure at only 3 attack. Spell Burst is a little bit more awkward to use than something, say, like Rotnest Drake, which is both more aggressively statted and often doesn't demand a follow-up card. It's, got to have something in hand, but that's okay because you're not spending mana necessarily like you would have to with Crawlisk Bark Stripper. And I can tell you, after trying to make this work in the invitational tournament yesterday, I kind of like Crawlisk Bark Stripper even less than I did before. He is sometimes awkward. If there's just a 1/1 on board, this guy becomes a huge pain to try to use just because you can't snipe the big 8/8 because there's a 1/1 there. So I'm not exactly sure why players liked this one a ton. I think they just saw, oh, Deadly Shot on a stick. It's got stats on top of Deadly Shot. Deadly Shot's awesome. But perhaps haven't yet considered the awkwardness that this follow-up of a spell burst entails. Now, that said, if we get enough awesome cheap spells for Hunter, if the meta moves away from small dudes existing, this card could pop into a Highlander list. I still don't ever think this is like a 2 of and a really strong Beast Hunter deck or a Spell Burst Hunter deck. I don't think that's a likely path for this card to exist. But, the numbers on it still kind of make sense. It's really just more about context and meta fit that are going to hold this one back, in my opinion. All right, next up here is Robes of Protection. Neutral 3-drop people seem to like pretty well. I think a lot of people envision this as like a way to protect your board. Like you develop some nice early threats and then you drop a Robe of Protection and your opponent can't like Frostbolt them or Ray of Frost them. Because we've seen can't be targeted work fairly well in things like Dragon Hunter. There's a few targets there. Even like in Big and Druid of old, it was kind of hard to deal with some of their stuff that couldn't be targeted. So I think people were extrapolating that, like, oh, okay, cool, I'm going to get a board, I'm going to play this, and it's going to protect it, and it's going to be awesome, and I'm going to snowball. The reality is that no deck has actually made room for Robes of Protection. It is virtually unplayed. Again, on this one, I happen to get this one right. I don't want to gloat too much on the first few of these that I nailed. But to be serious, I think that the problem for Robes of Protection is realistically just that it doesn't do enough. You have other 3-drops that are actively adding to your pressure. And for a deck that's like creating pressure and wanting that follow-up, sometimes just having a big 3/4 that does something cool is way better. Because instead of kind of investing in your first few turns, it's more about just continuing to amp up the pressure by developing more stats, higher statted minions, something that does damage immediately or helps you swing a board. This is a little bit more passive. It's still super susceptible to any kind of AoE effect that's not targeted or random targeting effects, which we've seen quite a few of pop up, all the different arcane missiles and devolving missiles, etc. So, the worlds and the metas where this card becomes really impactful are pretty limited. There's only, a couple matchups, a couple sort of meta scenarios you could imagine or Robes of Protection's better than just a 3-drop. There's so much opportunity cost to overcome with Robes of Protection. And it's so bad when it's by itself. Like if you just want to play a 3-drop because your first 2 cards didn't stick, you don't want to be playing a 2/4 that does nothing. You want to be playing something awesome and big and meaningful. So, between those two things, dependency on boards and other cards, and the fact that it only works in really specific scenarios, I'm not at all surprised Robes of Protection hasn't gotten there. And frankly, I don't think it really ever will. I don't think this card will see play. This is one that I'm kind of saying it's probably going to stay where it's at as a non-competitive card. So I'd love to be surprised. I hope I'm wrong. I hope this pops into some list somewhere and makes sense, but I just don't see that happening. All right, next up, our first of the 2 legendaries on this list. It's Professor Slate for Hunter. This one falling 83 spots. I gave Professor Slate 2 stars once again. Pretty accurate rating as far as I'm concerned. And man, did I get some hate from you guys on YouTube. Jeez, a lot of you were just like coming at me about Professor Slate. Regis, you're an idiot. How could you possibly give him 2 stars? He's insane. He's going to go crazy. So I'm going to gloat a little on this one. Like, yeah, he's not that crazy. Calm down. Can he be good later? Yeah, maybe still. But the notion that he's just like some amazing instant 5-star card is absurd. So back off a little bit, guys. Back off. Some of you are great. Don't worry. But Slate certainly hasn't gotten there. People have, goofed around with a few lists that were like, okay, but certainly haven't popped into the meta. They're not competitively refined like you'd expect for a card like this. And the reasons for that for me are clear. It's just that, again, he's a card that's really dependent on other stuff. You have to have spells to use with Slate to make him feel good. You might say, oh, but he's a 3-mana 3/4. Well, yeah, at this stage, a lot of cards are 3-mana 3/4s or equivalents. They have to have upside. They have to have follow-up that makes them better. And his is a follow-up that's so hard to achieve, particularly from a deck building standpoint for Hunter. It's hard to run enough spells to really make this guy make sense. You go, well, I'm going to run Rapid Fires. Well, yeah, but Rapid Fire is not a great card unless Professor Slate is in your hand. And even then, you're starting to spend more and more mana to support Professor Slate. So you have all these like kind of mediocre cards that are trying to support each other. You have to have them all at the same time for them to be good. And you're building these codependencies inside of your deck that are really going to limit its consistency. And like, yeah, you're going to have that pop-off game every once in a while, but every other time you're sitting on dead cards in hand or just weak cards in hand that don't get there. So unless Hunter gets some kind of ridiculously cool AoE style effect and they can combine it with Kel'Thuzad and they shift into a control game plan, Professor Slate just doesn't really make much sense for the kinds of game plans Hunter has traditionally been able to explore and utilize well. That doesn't mean this is a fundamentally bad card. Like, it clearly in some classes would be insane, and we could get cards to support it. So I'm not condemning him forever. I'm just saying right now he doesn't look like he makes sense. And frankly, unless there's a big shift in a design focus for his class, I don't really think he ever will make sense, but that is a possibility. He's got a little bit of potential to do something eventually. That said, for now, Slate just is not getting there in the meta. All right, moving on to the number 2 spot now. It's actually another card I got a lot of hate for. Playmaker here, falling 94 spots. That is a huge fall when you're talking about only 135 cards in expansion. So, from somewhere inside the top 20, I think, down to, practically the bottom of the expansion. And I gave this one 3 stars. And I got a lot of hate for giving it 3 stars, which is like a playable rating. That means I think it could pop into a low tier deck and make sense, but still a ton of hate on this one as well. Another one people thought was like a 5-star card in many cases, at least on my YouTube channel. And, I think the problem for Playmaker almost comes into its name, Playmaker. In other words, you kind of have to set this card up. It takes some planning, some foresight, and multiple follow-ups for it to really feel good. We often compared it to something like Bloodsworn Mercenary and said like, well, Playmaker's got way more upside than Bloodsworn. It can only summon 1 minion, and Playmaker can summon you like 3 or 4, and they're a rush minion, so they're trading immediately. There's these awesome swing turn potentials. But the problem is, you have to have like the 3 mana for Playmaker, right? And then you have to have multiple rush minions for it to make sense, which means you're lining up this perfect scenario where your opponent has this board and you have this much mana and these many minions in hand, and you're making the play. And sometimes setups like that just don't come together because you have to have all these cards in hand, and it's the right set of sort of board state, and you have to be late enough in the game to have enough mana to squeeze all that into a single turn. The thing about Bloodsworn Mercenary is it was like more reactive to your board state. Like you did something and it's like, oh shoot, Bloodsworn's pretty amazing here. Or maybe a minion lingered into a future turn and you have 3 extra mana. It's like, oh my god, Bloodsworn's pretty amazing here. And then beyond that, Bloodsworn can be used with charge minions. So you've got this natural combo set up. It's like, okay, I'm gonna enrage my Kor'kron, Bloodsworn's a ton of damage output for 3 mana. Playmaker doesn't have that same finishing potential. It doesn't have the same follow-up potential because it's way more about setting things up and creating this perfectly concocted scenario to make it much better. So yeah, like maybe 1 out of 10 times, or let's even say 1 out of 5 times, Playmaker would make an awesome play. You swing the board better and you stabilize, and that's great. The other 4 out of 5 times, you're looking at this card and you're going, oh my god, I can't fit it in. It just doesn't make sense right now because it requires too much, and it just doesn't line up. So I mean, I guess there's still maybe a world where Playmaker gets there. I actually am less hopeful for this card now than I was at the time I rated it. Like, I kind of think this is a 2-star card right now. But if there is a super rush-centric warrior that's running every rush card and athletic studies and all these other things, or, Restless Mummy type cards where there's like extra value bundled into a single play, start making a place in the meta, I guess it's still possible that Playmaker gets there, but I still think that the tax, the overhead you're paying for Playmaker might just be a little bit too high for how we play Hearthstone today. So I still have my doubts. And then finally here, our number 1 most overrated card of Scholomance Academy. It's Disciplinarian Gandling. This guy fell 100 spots. He was ranked inside the top 10, and he's really not being played in any meaningful way at all. I've seen a couple lists that utilize him as it seems like a kind of secondary condition, a backup plan, or maybe just kind of tossing him in there for fun. But he definitely hasn't carved out a spot in a real meta deck in any reasonable or consistent way. Now, I also gave this card 4 stars. Like, I also thought Gambling had a lot of potential for big swing turns in the mid game. I thought you'd have things like egg style decks, even things like wisp style decks in Warlock in particular, where you have the ability to load up a hand pretty nicely. You dump a bunch of stuff at once, and Gambling just gives you this really nice board that classes like, say, Druid just can't answer because they aren't that good at dealing with multiple medium-sized minions or even 1 or 2 big minions like Gambling. In reality, we haven't seen that at all. I think it's just too much of a penalty to try to run wisps and desk imps in your deck for Gambling to work, even if you're using them in combination with things like Imprisoned Scrap Imp. It's just a little bit too inconsistent, and it makes your cards less impactful for per draw, which is a really big problem. Beyond that, the mana needed to play this with things like eggs is just a little bit too high, because if you're playing cards that cost mana on top of Gambling, you're looking at 5, 6, 7 mana turns, and for a card like this one that's relying on purely stats to get there, by the time you get to turn 6, 7, etc., opponents have way more ways to handle those stats. It's not as significant of a swing as you might need. They either have just minions on board they can trade in, or they've unlocked AoEs now that handle this. So Gambling falls in this weird gap where he's not really fast enough with his swings, or alternatively, not really big enough with his swings. So I don't even know if Gambling's great as just like a filler card. He's probably fine, but not exceptional. Definitely not the 4-star card that I implied in that scenario, and definitely not the 4-star plus card that the community attributed to Gambling here, putting him very near the top of their rankings. So I don't know where Gambling goes. I don't think he's a build around. I don't even know if he's a great inclusion on average. I still don't really see him in Priest in particular. And there's some Death Rattle stuff, but does Priest get that excited about a random 4/4? I don't think so. So to me, he's just fallen in this gap where he doesn't really line up. If you see a path forward for Gambling and you say, he's going to do this, and it's going to be in this deck, and it's going to be awesome, let me know. I'm really intrigued to see that. I want this card to succeed. Like, he's really cool to look at and play, and I love the idea of it and stuff. So I'm as excited for anybody for this to live up to his 4-star rating, 5-star rating by many people's interpretation. So if you see where he's going to go, what cards are going to be added, or what kind of like archetype or context he fits into really nicely, please let me know in the comments below. I'm excited to see where Gandling can go. But for now, he indeed is the most overrated card in Scholomance Academy. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for our top 5 overrated cards. Did you get these right? Did you say, no way, dude, that card sucks? Or did you take the bait on Professor Slate? Oh, that was a good rhyme. Wow, I'm a YouTuber, all right. So let me know what you thought about each of these in the comments below. Were you right? Were you wrong? Are you still going to be right? Are these cards going to turn out to be amazing somewhere down the road? I want to hear all that. So share your takes. Thanks much, as always, for watching these sorts of videos. And until next time, game on.